World War II shook the entire world to its core, and its reverberations have been felt across the globe for decades. It led to the deaths of tens of millions of people, the destruction of many cities, towns, villages and other infrastructure, and also displaced tens of millions of people from their homes. There was a lot of groundbreaking technology used during combat for the first time, such as aerial combat and nuclear weapons. There is no doubting that this war changed the world forever, and it has left everybody on edge hoping that another war of this scale breaks out. With a lot of countries now having a nuclear arsenal, any such war could be even more catastrophic and could lead to the entire annihilation of a given country. However, thankfully there have been no global conflicts since the Second World War, and hopefully, it long continues in that way. It is still a fascinating topic, studying the battles that took place and looking at the tactics that were used on and off the battlefield. There were great feats of innovation and industry during the Second World War that changed how people live their lives. You always hear stories about people finding some great artifacts from the Second World War, such as weapons or gear and the likes, as well as cities and towns having to be evacuated after the discovery of some unexploded ordnance that was dropped during the war. The frequency of these discoveries still hasn't slowed down even though more than 7 decades have passed since the conflict. Some of these artifacts are truly astonishing and will blow your mind. Air warfare was first introduced in the Second World War, and this led to a lot of devastation both in the air and on the ground and sea. This meant that many targets that were previously unreachable could now be targeted with attacks from the air, causing widespread devastation and panic. As the war went on, more sophisticated aircraft and weapons were created which caused further damage and casualties. The Japanese even got to a stage where they began to use their own aircraft as weapons, performing suicide missions whereby they would fly their planes into American ships in the Pacific Ocean. There have been many stories about unexploded ordnance that was dropped by aircraft during World War II being found, but recently in the Netherlands, there was a discovery of an actual jet plane. For example, in June of 2010 there was an Allied 500 kg bomb found by construction workers about 23 feet under the ground in Göttingen, Germany, which exploded when the expert team had been trying to disarm the bomb. This led to the deaths of 3 people, with another 6 people being injured. In January of 2013, a digger caused a World War II bomb to be detonated after debris struck it, leading to the death of the digger operator and wounding several others. The jet plane discovery was made in October of 2014, and it was in a field on a farm located nearby the Delen Airbase in Aar, Netherlands, that workers from the Museum Delen Airbase made the discovery of a Messerschmitt 262. It is believed that this plane had been shot down on September 12, 1944 near to the village of Elden, and that it had remained there since. The pilot was named as Unteroffizier Schotter, and he was killed in the aircraft. What the Germans had done when it happened was remove the wreckage and place it in Delen and hid the plane in a bomb crater so it would not be seen. There was only a single type of aircraft carrier that had been built by the German Navy during the Second World War. This was called the Graf Zeppelin, and it was initially launched in 1938, the year before the start of the war. It was in May of 1941 that Hitler had been informed by the Grand Admiral Reeder that they had managed to get 85% through the building of the Graf Zeppelin and that it would be fully finished and ready to be used by 1942. However, then it turned out to not be the case, and by 1943 it was still only 95% complete, and Hitler lost interest in the project, and eventually, it became abandoned due to his lack of interest. After the end of the Second World War ended in 1945, this aircraft carrier on the 25th of April was scuttled in Stettin, Poland, in the shallow waters. This was done to ensure that the Russians could not get their hands on this aircraft carrier and learn details about German engineering. Despite these efforts, it was in March 1946 that the Russians successfully managed to reflate the aircraft carrier, and it was brought by a tow from Poland over to Leningrad, where they aimed to conduct repairs on the carrier. However, as time went by, nothing was done by the Russians to try and repair the carrier, so eventually, it was brought back to the coast of Poland. It was in 1947 that the Russians started to use the Graf Zeppelin for their target practice of their aircrafts and ships. Despite having directly hit it with 24 bombs and other projectiles, the carrier was still floating. In the end, it took a copula of torpedoes to finally sink her. For decades it was unsure as to what the exact location the carrier was sunk at, until 2006 when the Petro-Baltic managed to discover the wreckage. This is a ship that is owned by the Polish oil company, and the wreck was discovered near to the EBA port. This grave was confirmed later that year by a Polish survey ship, and it was officially identified as being the Graf Zeppelin, and she was lying about 264 feet under the surface of the water. It was almost 7 decades following the end of the Second World War in March of 2015 that the Musashi Japanese battleship that had been sunk was finally found in the Sibuyan Sea, which is by the coast of the Philippines. The researchers were confident that they managed to discover the ship after they managed to identify a Type 89 gunner turret on the wreckage, which was one of the standout features of the Musashi, which had been at the time up there with the largest battleships that had ever been created. This ship was part of the exclusive Yamato class of ships that the Japanese Navy had as they were constructed by the Japanese Imperial Navy, and in terms of ships during the Second World War, these were the most heavily armed and most powerful ships in existence on either side of the divide. It was near the end of 1944 that the United States managed to sink the Musashi after they hit it with a total of 19 torpedoes, as well as receiving a further 17 bomb hits from American aircraft on the 24th of October, 1944 in the midst of the Battle of the Leyte Gulf. Approximately half of the ship's crew were subsequently rescued, and it was the co-founder of Microsoft, Paul Allen, who managed to find the wreckage in 2015 alongside a team of researchers he had been working with. There had been other plans over the years involving the wreckage. There were multinational commemorations that took place every year in order to honor those who had fallen in the battle, beginning in the year 2006. In 2008, there were talks in Japan of locating the remains of the Musashi, which at that time had not been rediscovered. It was in 1942 that they had first been reported missing after he never returned to the airbase after being out on a mission. They were of the belief that the ship had sunk completely in a single piece, so they were thinking about refloating it, having it towed to an island that was close by, and then turning it into a war museum. This was an astonishing discovery made over 7 decades later, and it showcases what amazing discoveries can be lurking just around the next corner if you know where to look. This, of course, would be a fascinating idea if it had come to fruition. It had been a Curtiss Kitty Hawk fighter jet that he had been flying, and it is believed that this plane had crashed in the desert. However, as mentioned, when the wreckage was discovered in 2015, it was in scattered remains, so this plan could not be realized. The pilot in question was named as Flight Sergeant Kopping, and it was initially believed that it was the Luftwaffe who had shot him down close to the Libya-Egypt border. After more than 70 years of being missing, an RAF pilot's body was finally found, located in the Egyptian desert. They subsequently figured out that he had in fact managed to get lost in the midst of a huge sandstorm, and he ended up crashing after becoming disorientated while flying over a desert that had no features. The plane wreck and body were discovered in 2012 by a team of Polish oil workers. They made a report of their findings to the authorities, who subsequently discovered the aircraft, which had been somewhat destroyed alongside a parachute. Therefore, Sergeant Kopping seemingly survived the initial crash and had tried to get back to base by foot, but he was undoubtedly killed in the end by the extreme desert heat. This is why aircraft boneyards prefer these types of conditions. There are currently plans in place to have this plane brought to a British museum. In total over the years, there were about 13,738 P-40s manufactured, with only about 28 of them still being airworthy. The reason why this plane had remained in such good condition was because of the extremely arid conditions, which meant that there was little to no corrosion of the plane's metal surfaces. The CVL-22, or more commonly known as the Independence, was part of a total of 90 ships that had been assigned to the Operation Crossroads mission, which were the tests being undertaken for the atomic bombs. These were taking place at the Bikini Atoll located in the Marshall Islands. In 1951 the ship was scuttled, and not many people were aware of what it had been used for following its involvement in the atomic bomb tests. It was in 2015 that the shipwreck was found. A team of researchers began to work on the comparisons of sonar images taken of the wreckage with those from declassified documents. This allowed them to figure out that this ship had subsequently been utilized as a nuclear waste receptacle and radiology laboratory between 1946 and 1950. This had been one of the initial ships that had been converted into a lightweight aircraft carrier after most of the American fleet had been destroyed during the Pearl Harbor attack. The main areas in which the Independence operated in was the Western and Central Pacific between November of 1943 and August of 1945. Following the war, it received its designation to the Operation Crossroads, and it was as part of the fleet that had been placed approximately 1,700 feet away from where the ground zero blasts took place. This was done in order to see what effects the radiation, heat and shock waves would have on the ships. In total, during this testing period, there were a total of 21 ships that were sunk, but the Independence did manage to survive despite having received a lot of significant damage during the war. The ship eventually sank after there were 2 torpedoes precisely fired at it near to the keel and not near where the nuclear waste had been stored, which occurred in January of 1951.